was October 11th, 1943, and Colonel Neil E. Kirby and 3 of his men were attacking the Japanese base at Wewak in the Pacific. But the situation quickly went wrong when about 40 Japanese army fighters showed up to defend the base. The 4 men were heavily outnumbered, but Kirby considered the odds were even. Each of the 4 Republic P-47 Thunderbolts they were piloting was armed with a powerful machine gun battery of 8 50 caliber Browning MGs with a combined fire rate of 100 rounds per second. Without hesitating, the 4 U.S. aircraft joined the fray and began firing at the enemy formation with devastating consequences. The P-47s were well on their way to becoming the unstoppable juggernauts. Alexander Kartveli was born in 1896 to a wealthy family in Tiflis, Georgia, which was part of the declining Russian Empire of the Tsars. He was always fascinated by aircraft and enrolled in a military school when he was just 10 years old to become a sailor or a pilot. Kartveli got his chance to become a pilot in World War I and saw action at the front lines of the Eastern Front from 1915 to 1916. His proficiency then earned him an invitation to join several Russian pilots on a trip to the United States, where they would study aeronautics. The Russian Revolution broke out while they were in the US, and Kartveli was incapable of returning to his country, now the capital of communism. However, the seasoned airman was eventually hired by Curtiss Aeroplanes, where he served as a test pilot and aeronautical engineer. He was then promoted to major in the Army Air Corps Reserve. In the early 1930s, the U.S. Army Air Corps sought to replace the Seversky P-335, developed by another immigrant, Russian aviator Alexander P. Seversky. Kartveli, now working for Republic Aviation, submitted the AP-4 and AP-10 designs and variations of the P-43 Lancer. After several modifications, the Army Air Corps accepted the design and codenamed it XP-47, with testing beginning in 1940. The P-47 Thunderbolt had a wingspan of 41.9 feet, a length of 36.2 feet, a height of 14.7 feet, and an overall wing area of 299 square feet. If empty, it weighed 9,950 pounds, and its maximum takeoff weight was 17,500 pounds. The aircraft was powered by one Pratt & Whitney R2859 double wasp 18-cylinder air-cooled radial piston engine that produced over 2,500 horsepower to drive a 4-bladed propeller unit at the nose. Its maximum registered speed was 433 miles per hour, while its approximate range was about 445 miles at normal speed. In addition, its service ceiling was almost 41,000 feet, and the rate of climb was 3,200 feet per minute. Besides its clipped wings, it appeared as though the P-47 had no distinctive features, which made it stand out. It also had a standard cockpit with good visibility, a tail-dragger undercarriage, and standard performance. Nevertheless, its true power came from its armament, which was genuinely destructive for a fighter aircraft. The aircraft's standard armament comprised 8 50 caliber Browning M2 air-cooled heavy machine guns, while 4 MGs were placed in each wing in a staggered arrangement. This allowed feeding from side-by-side ammunition boxes with over 350 rounds for each Browning MG. Notably, the 8 high-caliber machine guns made the P-47 one of the few American aircraft to carry almost twice the firepower of a fighter. This combined rate of fire and damage made the Thunderbolt an extremely lethal opponent against hostile air, sea, and ground targets. In mere seconds, the P-47 could pour more than 200 rounds of ammunition into a target, making its machine gun battery a force to be reckoned with. Its combined rate of fire was something never seen before with this type of aircraft. A few bursts were more than enough to ravage a hostile airfield and other infrastructures such as barracks, ammunition, and supply deposits. And when it came to engaging other enemy aircraft in dogfights, a single precise burst of a P-47 Thunderbolt could take the target down, especially Japanese aircraft that lacked proper armor. The same happened when the Thunderbolt engaged enemy bombers. Its machine gun battery could quickly dispatch a German or Japanese bomber mere seconds after making contact. Despite its impressive firepower, the 8 machine guns had one disadvantage. They were too heavy. This made the P-47 considerably weightier than other American single-engine fighters. It is said that Kartveli himself said, quote, "It will be a dinosaur, but it will be a dinosaur with good proportions." Moreover, as if that was not enough firepower for one aircraft, the inclusion of a 20mm cannon was considered at some point, but ditched after considering the aircraft's weight. This model gave the aircraft a top speed of just 50 miles per hour, which made it useless for dogfights or bombing missions. Still, that did not stop the Thunderbolt from carrying up to 2,500 pounds of bomb load to decimate German and Japanese ground objectives. The P-47 could also carry 10 unguided HVAR rockets for use against sea and ground targets, and drop tanks could be exchanged for M2 ammunition boxes placed along the fuselage or hardpoints. There were numerous variants of the P-47, with the first one being the B model, which had an engine of 2,000 horsepower and was delivered to the British and the USAAF in 1943. Over 160 were produced before being relegated as trainers with the introduction of improved variants. The C model had a more powerful engine and minor modifications to the fuselage, which was lengthened by 8 inches to house an external fuel tank for long-range operations over German and Japanese-controlled skies. However, the D model was the most widely produced version of the P-47. The aircraft's engine had war emergency power or water injection to increase efficiency, and the landing gear tires were improved for rough landings. The controls were also simplified for the pilot, and more hardpoints were added to carry 10 HVAR rockets or 3 drop tanks. The P-47 Hot Rod variant was a unique version specifically designed for an interceptor role. Its objective was to quickly chase and take down the devastating German Vengeance V1 rockets. This model had a top speed of 473 miles per hour and was able to take down some German Arado AR-234 jet bombers and Me-262 jet fighters. The P-47N became the last Thunderbolt model. Its wings were lengthened to 18 inches, and the wing tips were clipped to increase the effectiveness of rolling maneuvers. Over 1,800 N models were produced, and they only served in the Pacific, where they excelled in combat and bombing operations. Several experimental models also gained attention. One of them was the XP-47E, which was based on the B model and featured a pressurized cockpit. Another was the XP-47F, which was used to experiment with laminar flow wings and was lost during a fatal accident in October of 1943. And then there was the XP-47H, which was fitted with Chrysler engines, and the P-47J, which was an attempt to reduce the weight of the Thunderbolt while increasing engine power. The first P-47s arrived in Europe at the end of 1942. American pilots began to use it months later, with the first combat encounter taking place over the skies of France in March of 1943. Its potent arsenal was put to the test after the P-47 began engaging both German and Japanese aircraft on different fronts. By the time the war ended, the P-47s had flown more than 740,000 sorties and claimed over 3,700 hits at the cost of 3,500 losses. There were several American aces that reached legendary status aboard the Thunderbolt. Captain Robert S. Johnson took down 27 enemy aircraft aboard different variants of the P-47 while flying over the Netherlands, Belgium, and other major European cities for bombing and escort missions. Another American ace was Lieutenant Colonel Francis E. Grabeski, who claimed 28 enemy aircraft while fighting on the Western Front. As commander of the 61st Fighter Squadron, Grabeski flew over the skies of France and Germany, taking down several FW-190s and BF-109s during escort missions with B-17 Flying Fortresses. Another remarkable pilot was Colonel Hubert Zemke, who commanded the 56th Fighter Group, known as Zemke's Wolfpack because of their fearlessness in battle. Although Zemke was not initially convinced of the P-47's performance, he exploited its strengths to make it an excellent platform for all of his men. Zemke claimed 18 aircraft shootdowns and excelled so much at his job that he was relieved of his unit to serve with General Curtis E. LeMay in Washington. The P-47 has been used by the British Royal Air Force since 1942. and its different models were employed across all of Europe, the Pacific, and during the Southeast Asia campaign to defend India and other territories from the Japanese. Also, the Free French Air Forces that were not part of the Vichy regime were given over 440 P-47Ds to fight the German occupation of France. During the Italian campaign of 1943, the Brazilian Expeditionary Force flew some 50 P-47Ds that were used by the Brazilian Air Force 1st Fighter Squadron. Their P-47s flew over 440 sorties and earned a Presidential Unit citation in the 1980s. The same happened with the famous Mexican 201st Fighter Squadron at the Pacific Theater. The brave Mexican pilots flew P-47Ds as part of the U.S. 5th Air Force in the Philippines, performing over 780 sorties without losing a single aircraft against the Japanese. Another partner of the U.S., the Soviet Union, also received numerous P-47Ds that were used to defend Soviet cities from German bombing missions. And when the war ended, surplus P-47s were sold to the Chinese Nationalist Air Force to fight against the Communist forces, while others were used by the French during the Algerian War of Independence. Decades later, the legacy of the P-47 Thunderbolt was resurrected when the U.S. Air Force issued a requirement for a dedicated close air support or CAS aircraft. This warplane would eventually become Fairchild Republic's A-10 Thunderbolt II. Although Mitsubishi Zero is Japan's most recognizable aircraft of World War II, it was not the fastest or more powerful. That place belongs to a simple float plane that evolved into Japan's last hope against the United States, the Kawanishi N1K2J Shidenkai, or George. The Shidenkai was superior to the Zero in armament, speed, armor, and most importantly, maneuverability, making it capable of successfully engaging U.S. Navy Corsairs and Hellcats and emerging victorious. A unique and creative feature, incorporated by the Shidenkai's engineers, made the aircraft highly mobile and effective in combat, an idea so effective that it could have brought Japan to victory if it had arrived earlier in the war. The Kawanishi Aircraft Company was founded in 1920, after the Empire of Japan had emerged victorious during the aftermath of World War I. The company was a derivative of the Kawanishi conglomerate, which had been funding the Nakajima Aircraft Company. In 1921, the company came up with its first aircraft, the mail carrier Kawanishi K-1, which became the first Japanese airplane to receive airworthiness certification from the Japanese Aviation Bureau. Although only one prototype was built, it paved the way for future Kawanishi aircraft designs. Many would end up being seaplanes, such as the H-6K and H-8K, as well as fighters, trainers, and bombers. As the thirst to conquer new territories grew among the Empire's army and navy, the entire Japanese industrial complex shifted toward military technological developments. In the 1930s, following the invasion of Chinese Manchuria and the eventual war with all of China, Kawanishi developed multiple floatplane fighters to support Japanese operations over the Pacific where no airstrips were available. When World War II broke out in 1939, and the Empire began to annex territories that once belonged to the Low Countries and the United Kingdom, the necessity for land-based fighters increased and surpassed that of floatplanes. Contrary to the Chinese, the British forces had a proper air force, and they retaliated with all they could muster. However, the Japanese now had airstrips from where they could launch air operations. In December of 1941, as the Empire prepared to strike the United States military in the Philippines and Pearl Harbor, engineers from Kawanishi Aircraft Company proposed a land-based variant of the floatplane fighter Kawanishi N1K1 Kyofu, or Mighty Wind. Also known as the Rex by the Allied forces, the Kawanishi N1K1 had proven successful as a floatplane fighter during the early stages of the war. However, its effectiveness diminished as the United States Navy developed more capable fighters to fight against the Empire. During dogfights and face-to-face encounters with the enemy, the Kawanishi N1K1 Rex struggled with maneuverability due to the heavy and bulky float it carried. According to Russell Lee, a curator in the aeronautics department of the Smithsonian Institution's National Air and Space Museum, the changes the Kawanishi engineers proposed to transform the floatplane to fly from land bases had an emphasis on maneuverability. These included removing the main float and the two wingtip floats and installing an 18-cylinder Homare engine to replace the standard 14-cylinder Kasei engine. In addition, a more sizable propeller was required to absorb the extra power from the new engines, and retractable landing gear with longer gear legs to keep the propeller off the ground. The new prototype was dubbed N1K1J Shiden, and the first was delivered on December 27, 1942. An Imperial test pilot successfully flew it for the first time that day. Although the prototype was far from perfect, the Imperial Navy Air Service and the Kawanishi aircraft engineers were satisfied with the result, rushing it into service with a delivery of over 1,000 units. Although the first batch of the N1K1J Shiden was done and ready, Kawanishi engineers revisited the design just days after its maiden flight. The objective was to work on some of the aircraft's most noticeable problems. The Shiden had retained some of the characteristics of its predecessor, the Rex, such as the mid-mounted wing of the floatplane, which led to the longer and heavier landing gear modifications. However, the aircraft's landing gear proved troublesome due to the inefficient heat treatment of the wheels. Another issue with the first units was the powerful but unreliable Nakajima NK9A Homare 11 18-cylinder radial engine. Although it could effectively produce over 2,000 horsepower, its effectiveness decreased as the aircraft reached more altitude. Some pilots reported a maximum output of merely 1,300 horsepower. With time, the Homare would improve with more powerful variants that retained its compact design, giving way to the production of over 9,100 engines. The Imperial Navy soon noticed that the Shiden had a longer range than the Mitsubishi J2M Raiden and was faster than the already iconic and swift Zero. Consequently, the redesign of the aircraft was approved and funded. Even so, the Shiden was still too heavy, and the engineers decided to make it lighter and more maneuverable. As such, the wing was moved to the bottom of the fuselage, the landing gear was shortened, the tail was redesigned, and the overall fuselage was lengthened. In addition, the innovative combat flaps of the first prototype that automatically adjusted in response to acceleration and kept the pilot focused on the combat were kept and improved. Kawanishi got rid of over 550 pounds of unnecessary weight with such modifications, making the new variant faster and more effective. Soon, production was simplified because more than a third of the original Shiden parts could be used with the new derivative, which was designated N1K2J Shiden Kai, meaning improved violet lightning. The revolutionary aircraft could be armed with 4 20mm Type 99 Mark II cannons mounted in the wings and 2 77mm Type 97 machine guns in the nose, and carry between 2 and 4 250-kilogram bombs, depending on the variant. It had a length of 29 feet, a wingspan of 39 feet, and a height of 13 feet, with a maximum takeoff weight of 9,526 pounds, and an incredible range thanks to an internal fuel capacity of 126 gallons, and over 85 gallons in an external drop tank. The N1K2J Shiden Kai flew for the first time on January 1, 1944, and was rushed into production after a brief test phase showed excellent combat capabilities and handling. However, the fate of the Japanese Empire changed during the last 2 years. It was now collapsing, and the Imperial Army and Navy were retreating across all fronts of Asia and the Pacific after the Americans' victory at the Battle of Guadalcanal in 1943. As a result, air and naval supremacy now belonged to the United States and the Allies, but the Japanese were confident that introducing the Shiden Kai would help even the odds against the American F-6F Hellcats and G4U Corsairs. Even more importantly, the Imperial Navy trusted the Shiden Kai would counter the high-flying B-29 bombers ravaging mainland Japan with devastating bombing raids. The Shidenkai, or George, as the Americans called it, was considerably superior to the famous A6M0. It was about 20 miles faster, coming up at a maximum speed of over 370 miles per hour at 18,000 feet. Additionally, it could roll at 82 degrees per second at 240 miles per hour, thanks to its mercury switch that automatically extended the flaps during turns. These combat flaps enhanced the maneuverability of the fighter, generating more lift and allowing tighter turns. The combat flaps were triggered by a tube that held the mercury switch, linked to the Kai's static air system. According to curator Russell Lee, the system automatically detected the amount of G-force and airspeed during a steep run and deployed the flaps without pilot intervention. This feature was unique to the Shidenkai, and no other fighter in World War II used anything similar. The Imperial Japanese Navy gathered its most experienced pilots and formed the 343rd Kokutai Naval Air Group. The pilots were led by the legendary Minoru Genda, who aided Admiral Yamamoto in the attack on Pearl Harbor. The Shidenkai faced American Hellcats and F-4U Corsairs with even odds. In February of 1945, Lieutenant Kanayoshi Muto and his unit of Kais engaged a unit of Hellcat pilots and shot down 4 without any losses of their own. A month later, the elite 343rd Kokutai engaged U.S. Navy carriers and aircraft in a series of intense dogfights with a dozen Hellcats and accurate anti-aircraft fire. During the skirmish, the 343rd lost 6 Shidens, but downed at least 8 Hellcats. Then, on June 2nd, pilots from the 343rd engaged Corsairs from USS Shangri-La over Kagoshima Bay and also shot down more American aircraft than what they lost. Even so, the Shidenkai arrived too late to change the outcome of the war for Japan. Overall, only 401 K2J Shidenkais were produced out of a total of 1,400 Shidens. Such models remained operational until the end of the war against the United States, and the 343rd Air Group was disbanded on August 14th when the Emperor surrendered. Some Shidenkais can be appreciated today in several museums across the United States, including the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force and the National Air and Space Museum. Amid the rapid technological maelstrom of World War II, cutting-edge aircraft in 1939 found themselves obsolete by 1942, as the aviation industry churned out ever more fearsome and sophisticated warbirds. Early trailblazers, like the unique-looking Handley Page Hampton, taking to the skies in the conflict's unpredictable and hazardous early days, faced immense challenges, often leaning on what swiftly became dated technology amidst the war's relentless pace. Yet, even when thrust into combat scenarios far beyond its original design parameters, the Hampton stood as a testament to resilience and adaptability. It etched its name in history by executing the first daring nighttime bombing runs deep into German territory, sorties often viewed at the time as journeys with no return. While its modest armor and limited bomb capacity were evident drawbacks, the valiant pilots of this pioneering bomber leveraged its commendable speed, agility, and range. They daringly ventured further than any other Allied aircraft of the time, taking the fight straight to Germany's core in some of the most dangerous and spectacular nighttime raids of World War II. During the 1930s, the Royal Air Force couldn't foresee the daunting challenges British pilots would encounter within the coming decade. In 1932, the Air Ministry released Specification B-932, calling for a twin-engine day bomber that would outperform all its predecessors. Handley Page responded with an audacious design that quickly won the Air Ministry's endorsement, primarily because it struck an ideal balance between range, payload, and speed. While the British authorities anticipated a groundbreaking aircraft that would propel the RAF to the forefront of combat aviation, they were blindsided when the outcome was nearing obsolescence by its maiden voyage. By early 1936, the inaugural prototype, the HP-52, sporting serial number K4240, turned heads. It boasted a sleeker design compared to its contemporaries, hinting at unmatched speed and agility. Upon seeing the aircraft's slender yet deep fuselage, just 3 feet across, C.G. Gray, founder of the Aeroplane magazine, quipped, quote, "It looks like a flying suitcase," a moniker that forever clung to the aircraft. In August 1936, buoyed by the successful test flights of the K-4240, the Air Ministry greenlit an initial production run, commissioning 180 units, in line with specification B-3036. At the same time, an order for another 100 aircraft, powered by the Napier Dagger engine, went to Belfast Short in Harland. Early 1937 saw the completion of a second prototype, the L7271, which distinguished itself with features like a more contoured ventral defensive gun stance and a tweaked nose. The L4032, a subsequent prototype fitted with the Pegasus 18 engines, came into the picture with a redesigned nose featuring an optically flat bomb-aiming panel and revamped ventral and dorsal gun positions. On June 24, 1938, L4032 was ceremonially named by Lady Catherine Mary Montague Douglas Scott, Viscountess Hampton, at Radlett Aerodrome, coinciding with its inaugural flight. In her address, Viscountess Hampton invoked, quote, "the spirit of John Hampton, the defender of civil liberties, to embolden the aircraft's future crews." By the close of 1938, production blueprints for the Hampton crystallized. Apart from Handley Page's assembly line, English Electric in Preston, Lancashire, would also churn out units, and a dedicated Canadian facility would augment the production. Within a few years, a staggering 1,430 units rolled off the assembly lines, making it one of the UK's most prolific bombers when World War II erupted. As the freshly minted bomber began joining RAF squadrons worldwide, pilots hailed it as a reliable and efficient warbird, marking a significant leap in the evolution of British bomber designs. The wing architecture was particularly groundbreaking for its era. It endowed the bomber with capabilities previously uncharted in British aviation. Instead of a monolithic structure, the wings were an intricate assemblage of 3 primary components: the center section, the port outer wing, and the starboard outer wing. Each segment had further subdivisions, a testament to the meticulous design. Each wing's foundational strength is derived from a main girder spar, ensuring structural resilience. This was augmented by a leading and trailing edge section, the latter being pivotal to the aircraft's aerodynamics. Moreover, the wings integrated hydraulically actuated trailing edge flaps. These flaps, paired with the ailerons, were reinforced with robust D-spars. Aviation author Philip J.R. Moyes asserted that the wing's design wasn't merely for aesthetics, but was an aerodynamic coup. The pronounced taper of the wings, combined with their design focus on minimizing drag, endowed the Hampton with an impressive top speed of 265 miles per hour, a staggering pace for its time. Yet, even with such speed, the aircraft maintained a commendable landing speed of 73 miles per hour. However, speed, safety, and elegance did not equate to comfort. The Hampton's slender fuselage was a tight squeeze, designed to fit only one person across. The navigator was positioned right behind the pilot, and accessing the cockpit required folding the seats down. Once inside, movement was virtually non-existent, making extended missions a test of endurance. This close confinement led to a slew of nicknames for the Hampton, such as the Flying Suitcase, Panhandle, and Flying Tadpole. British airman Wilfred John Mike Lewis recounted his experience, quote, "I did my first flight and first tour on Hamptons. A beautiful aeroplane to fly, terrible to fly in. Cramped, no heat, no facilities where you could relieve yourself. You got in there and you were stuck there. The aeroplane was like a fighter. It was only 3 feet wide on the outside of the fuselage, and the pilot was a very busy person." In a twist of fate, the Flying Suitcase was soon selected for the longest and most dangerous aerial mission of the war until then, a bombing raid on the heart of Germany. With the eruption of war in 1939, Hamptons were first tasked with armed aerial reconnaissance missions, keeping tabs on German naval movements during daylight hours. This proved catastrophic. Despite its commendable speed and agility, the Hampton was hopelessly outmatched by the modern Luftwaffe fighters, which outpaced the British bombers at nearly every turn. By December 1939, a somber bomber command conceded that relying on the Hampton for daylight operations was unrealistic. This admission stung, especially since the Hampton was conceived as a daytime bomber. Merely a year after its deployment, the aircraft seemed on the brink of redundancy. The scarcity of capable bombers was acutely felt after France's capitulation. Britain found itself exposed. The Germans now occupied vast swaths of territory just a stone's throw across the English Channel, and the Allies lacked the means to even contemplate striking back at Germany. Adding insult to injury, the Luftwaffe initiated a relentless bombing campaign against Britain. British civilians confronted the grim specter of war on their doorsteps for the first time, leading to a precipitous drop in morale. The RAF needed to counteract decisively, demonstrating their capability to penetrate the heart of Germany and project aerial might undeterred. However, Berlin lay nearly 600 miles distant, a seemingly insurmountable stretch for contemporary warplanes. Moreover, reaching Germany's epicenter meant traversing miles upon miles of fortified enemy airspace. In 1939, when combatant nations still sought to honor President Franklin D. Roosevelt's plea to confine air raids to military objectives, the British were further constrained. They had to mount their raids during daylight to minimize civilian casualties, yet this made their bombers tantalizing prey for Luftwaffe interceptors. But the paradigm shifted dramatically post-May 14, 1940, in the aftermath of the Luftwaffe's relentless bombing of Rotterdam. The British discarded daytime raids in favor of audacious nighttime incursions into German territory. It was up to the flying suitcase to reinvent itself as an unparalleled nocturnal bomber. It had the range and the speed to do it, if not intercepted by the Luftwaffe. The onus was on this aircraft to showcase to the world that Britain, too, could strike at the very heart of the enemy. On March 19, 1940, Hampton spearheaded the first nighttime assault on German soil, targeting the seaplane hangars in Hernum Sylt. The British aviators, eager to deliver retribution to Germany's doorstep, were all too aware of the monumental risks ahead. Navigating the hostile expanse, pilots grappled with a gauntlet of perils. The skies buzzed with the incessant menace of anti-aircraft fire, or flak, a rain of lethal shrapnel that could instantly maim or annihilate their bombers. Then, there was the ever-looming threat of the Luftwaffe, armed with cutting-edge aircraft and elite fighter pilots. But it wasn't just enemy combatants that posed a threat. The unforgiving weather, often obscuring vision and impeding aircraft performance, multiplied the hazards of collisions or veering off course. Nighttime operations, with their inherent limited visibility, were particularly treacherous. The inky, lightless terrains below offered scant reference points, and the era's primitive navigation systems weren't always up to the task. Yet, perhaps the heaviest cross to bear was the immense psychological burden. The ceaseless tension of piercing enemy lines, the hours spent in the confining belly of the flying suitcase, and the harrowing sight of fellow airmen plummeting from the skies. Each mission was a profound test of their mettle. Still, amid these hellish conditions, British pilots showcased their indomitable spirit, determined to fulfill their duty. By August 1940, the Hampton raids on Germany had become a grim routine, with casualty rates remaining alarmingly high. On the night of August 12, 1940, 11 Hamptons were dispatched to destroy the old aqueduct that bridged the canal over the River Ems, just north of Munster. Among those leading the sortie was Flight Lieutenant Roderick Leroyd, piloting Hampton P-4403 EAM. His crew consisted of pilot Officer John Lewis, Sergeant Walter Ellis, and leading aircraftman William Rich as gunner. That night, the skies were rife with peril. The relentless barrage of flak seemed omnipresent, turning the firmament into a nightmarish gauntlet. By the time they reached their target, enemy fire had already claimed 2 Hamptons, while 2 others were limping away, severely damaged. Yet for British airmen like Leroyd, such adversity was all in a day's work. Leroyd steered his flying suitcase with unwavering resolve through a maelstrom of searchlights and enemy fire. Risking it all, he descended to a hair-raising altitude of just 150 feet, speeding towards the target. At this daringly low height, Leroyd released his explosive payload, igniting a series of blasts that came dangerously close to his own aircraft. Before he could even complete his bombing run, enemy fire wreaked havoc on the Hampton, disabling its hydraulic system and rendering the wing flaps and undercarriage inoperative. Though the wing was grievously damaged, a silver lining remained. The fuel tanks were unscathed. Unyielding, Leroy persisted until every bomb was deployed. The beleaguered Hampton then mustered enough strength to retreat from the inferno and limp toward English shores. Approaching the home base, with dawn yet to break, Leroy realized the peril of attempting a nighttime landing in their compromised state. Not willing to risk his crew's lives after they had just escaped the jaws of hell, he orbited the base until daybreak, ensuring a safe landing without a single injury to his crew or further detriment to the Hampton. Leroy was honored with the Victoria Cross on September 9, 1940, for his unparalleled bravery and leadership. By then, he'd been relieved from active duty and promoted to a substantive flight lieutenant. Countless awe-inspiring endeavors akin to Leroy's heroics were carried out in the early war days by the unsung yet indomitable Handley Page Hampton. Though the Hampton was outpaced by advanced German adversaries, its grit was instrumental to the Royal Navy during the tumultuous initial months of conflict. While it was eventually succeeded by more advanced four-engine bombers like the Short Stirling and Avro Lancaster, the Hampton carved its niche in history. It stood as the herald of Allied resistance, reaching deep into German territory to deliver retribution. There was a time when some commercial airplanes were faster than those of the U.S. Army Air Corps, and military flying tactics were still significantly based on obsolete practices from World War I. However, such strategies would drastically change soon. In the late 1930s, Bell Aircraft presented the organization with a sleek concept, complete with a streamlined finish that made it look like a winner. The P-39 Airacobra was unlike anything ever seen before, and featured several innovations that marked a departure from conventional fighter design, heavily influencing future developments. The aircraft made quite the impression, and eventually became one of the most beloved fighters among pilots. However, it was not with the Americans that the Airacobra truly shined. On March 19, 1937, the United States Army Air Corps issued Specification X-609 for a high-altitude interceptor. In response, Bell Aircraft submitted two designs for a new aircraft fighter. The USAAC selected Model 4, and by October, the service ordered a prototype. A single XP-39 Airacobra was built and flew for the first time in early April of 1938. The model had some original features, like its fully enclosed Allison V12 engine, which drove a 10-foot drive shaft attached to the propeller gearbox at the nose. Oddly enough, the engine was positioned behind the cockpit, causing many doubts among pilots. This radical design decision was taken to place the engine after the center of gravity and increase maneuverability. Still, it gave the model a tendency to stall during tight turns and even go into a flat spin, something many pilots could not counteract. Nevertheless, it was eventually proved that the engine location was no more of a hazard in a crash landing than in a conventional array. Other features included automobile-type doors on both sides of the cockpit, which in turn had roll-down windows. But perhaps most noticeable was the type's tricycle landing gear, an innovation at the time, but a Bell trademark from then on. As for armament, the Airacobra was equipped with a 37mm T9 cannon in the nose, which fired through the propeller hub, just like the Bf-109. The fighter was also fitted with 2.5-inch and 2.3-inch Browning machine guns. The initial results were auspicious, as the aircraft was fitted with a turbo supercharger and could reach speeds of 390 miles per hour at an altitude of 20,000 feet. However, the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, or NACA, soon implemented several questionable changes of its own. To start with, they added more weight while removing desirable features, including the turbo supercharger. This turned out to be a significant mistake, causing the aircraft to fly a mere 368 miles per hour at an unremarkable altitude of 13,600 feet. In fact, it was not efficiently operable above 15,000 feet. Once the production P-39 was materialized, the fighter was relegated to low-altitude work, as it was incapable of fulfilling its envisioned combat role. Then, after a batch of 20 P-39Cs, the the first mass-produced version was born. The P-39D had heavier armor, self-sealing tanks, and additional machine guns in the wings. Evidently, the excess weight hampered the aircraft's already poor performance. Also, while it was not the engineer's fault, the P-39 had a shorter range than desired. However, the flaw was not noticed until the aircraft was deployed to the Pacific. At the time, it was customary that single-engine fighters took off at a moment's notice and returned to a nearby base, and were thus designed as short-range aircraft. Despite its flaws, the Airacobra was noticed by several Allied countries. Soon, France ordered no less than 200 aircraft, but when the country was defeated and occupied by the Nazis in 1940, the British took over the order. The Purchasing Commission was ordered a total of 675 aircraft, with the intention of deploying them in dogfights. When the new fighters arrived in the summer of 1941, the British replaced the cannon with the 20mm Hispano-Suiza and the machine guns with Browning .303s. However, they soon realized that the fighter was slower than advertised, not to mention useless at high altitudes. Moreover, the fighter had a weak rate of climb. In October, after only 2 combat operations, the Airacobra Mark Is were retired from the front lines. After the Airacobra's disappointing performance, the British refused the rest of the order. Those aircraft then diverted back to the US and were redesignated P-400 to separate them from the regular ones, of which 200 were sent to the Australian Air Force to serve in the Pacific. On the other hand, 212 British P-39s were reallocated to the Soviet Union. In a strange twist of fate, that's where the model would find its redemption. Almost half of the total production of Airacobras ended up serving with the Soviets, where the fighter was highly regarded, and even produced 28 aces, with at least 15 victories each. Namely, Alexander Prokryshkin and Grigory Rechlikov scored 48 and 44 wins respectively while flying the fighter. The main reason the Airacobra shone in the Eastern Front was that most aerial battles took place at lower altitudes than in the rest of Europe. What's more, engagements would usually happen at 15,000 feet or less. In contrast, the situation in the rest of the continent required the majority of US fighters to escort high-altitude bombers, like the B-17 and B-24, on long-distance bombing raids. Given that American fighters covered bomber squadrons from 30,000 feet or higher, most dogfights took place at considerable altitudes. Meanwhile, the Russian landscapes and geographical situation required much shorter ranges and distances, and the Soviet Air Force was not engaged in bombing runs like the Allies. The Soviet government acquired significant Airacobras, starting in 1941 through a Lend-Lease program. Much like the Americans and British, Soviet pilots were skeptical of the strange aircraft at first. Some of the issues included the aircraft being prone to spins, tail deformations under high G-forces, and the need for high-quality fuel only. However, unlike the rest of the Allies, the Soviets eventually grew fond of the Airacobra, and Bell specialists even traveled to Moscow to solve many of the problems. The Airacobra had finally found its home. When the Japanese struck Pearl Harbor in 1941, the US had produced roughly 600 P-39s. At the time, both the Airacobra and the Curtiss P-40 were the top American land-based fighters. In April of 1942, the fighters first saw combat against the Japanese, but the fighter proved to be no match for the Zero. Compared to the best contemporary fighters, like the P-38, Bf-109, and the Zero, the model developed a bad reputation, mainly because of its underwhelming debut in the early European conflict. The fighter soon earned the nickname Iron Dog because it could not compete in the vast Pacific arena. Still, Airacobras were deployed throughout the world. Despite its shortcomings, the P-39 served reasonably well in the Pacific, flying missions to defend Port Moresby in New Guinea and Guadalcanal. In addition, the type saw service in the Aleutian Islands and eventually supported the Allied landings in Tunisia, Anzio, and Sicily. Understandably, the aircraft was often tasked with low-altitude missions, such as ground strafing. The Soviets appreciated its ground attack capabilities, and in October of 1942, Premier Joseph Stalin personally asked President Franklin Roosevelt to provide more fighters, especially Airacobras. Soon, more than 50 regiments were equipped with P-39s. The Soviet pilots considered the fighter stable, provided that its center of gravity was in the correct position. They claimed it had good taxiing speed and visibility, and that it was hard to flip over the nose. It also had light control forces, and the pilots enjoyed the cockpit heater, a new feature for them. While the Soviets did use the aircraft for ground attack missions, the Airacobra also covered other roles. And despite the additional complication that the P-39 was extremely difficult to handle because of its engine placement, the Soviet pilots valued the fighter. Besides, given that parts had to come all the way from New York to the Eastern Front, there was a considerable supply shortage. Nevertheless, the Soviets cleverly maximized their resources by scavenging damaged P-39s to keep others airworthy. Ultimately, about half of the total production of Airacobras was sent to the Soviets, with no less than 4,773 examples. The production of P-39s ended in August of 1944. By then, Bell had produced 9,584 Airacobras, half of which served with the Soviets, and many of which participated with the Free French and British forces. The Airacobra was always considered a suitable and decent enough aircraft for low-level operations. As the Aviation History Online Museum claimed, quote, "The Americans demanded the best fighter planes, and they got them, but the Russians used what was available and made the most out of what they had." Some claim it was a matter of training. German ace pilot Günter Rahl even expressed that, quote, "In capable hands, the P-39 was a challenge to the Bf-109 F and G models." In the end, perhaps the Airacobra's true legacy lies in the fact that it introduced many significant innovations that would be featured in later models, like the improved P-63 King Cobra, and most significantly, the first American jet-powered aircraft, the XP-59 Aerocomet. Vasily Emelianenko was nervous. His entire unit of rugged Ilyushin IL-2 Stromovik ground attack aircraft had just decimated a German-controlled airfield in eastern Ukraine. The Stormbirds had swiftly risen from the hills and rained hell on 2 rows of Luftwaffe aircraft. Despite the low altitude at which they were flying, German machine gun fire did little damage to the Stromovik's armor. However, a few moments later, one lucky shot made its way to Emelianenko's engine, and his aircraft barely reached the tall pines surrounding the enemy airfield. With oil pressure rapidly plummeting to zero, Emelianenko headed towards Soviet lines while German fighters were relentlessly chasing him. His Stromovik then made a hard landing in open terrain, and the young pilot now had to run into the woods before a German sniper picked him up. It was thanks to the outstanding resilience of the Stromovik, whose entire fuselage was made from pure steel armor, that Emelianenko survived. But it was just the beginning of the aircraft's career, as it went on to play a crucial role in the brutal Battle of Kursk. In the 1920s and 1930s, Europe and the United States embarked on a joint effort to develop a new type of aircraft that could provide ground support to friendly infantry and tanks. During this time, the Soviet Union began experimenting with the idea of a dedicated ground attack aircraft with enough armor to withstand combat at low altitudes when providing support fire. The premise behind the Stromovik warplanes was to field a flying tank that combined firepower, armor protection, and performance to neutralize unarmored and armored ground targets. As a so-called flying tank, the aircraft was designed to absorb intense ground-based fire first and enemy aircraft fire second. Nevertheless, the Red Army's attempts to develop the vehicle were unsuccessful. Designer Nikolai Polikarpov then came up with the R-5SH Stromovik and other aircraft that got close to what the Soviets required. As such, they were used during the Spanish Civil War of 1936 and the Battle of Khalkhin Gol against the Japanese in 1939. It was soon evident that the aircraft lacked engine power and sufficient armor to protect the pilots as intended. However, it all changed when Sergei Vladimirovich Ilyushin and his team from the Ilyushin Aircraft Design Bureau came up with a unique design that finally convinced Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. During the last months of 1938, Sergei Ilyushin suggested the idea of an authentic flying tank and asked Stalin to allow his bureau to develop it. The idea behind Ilyushin's design was to replace armor plates, which were too heavy and difficult to work with, and instead structure the entire fuselage from pure steel armor. Stalin was pleased and allowed Ilyushin to go forward without having to compete with anyone. 2 prototypes were ordered. They were single-engine, low-wing monoplanes, driven by a propeller and powered by a Mikulin AM-35 engine, which provided over 1,350 horsepower. These engines would later be replaced with more powerful ones. Their most notable feature was the inclusion of the armor in an airframe load-bearing scheme. The armored hull of riveted homogeneous armor steel protected the cockpit, engine, fuel tanks, and oil radiators. The prototypes were initially conceived as single-seaters, but were reconfigured as 2-seaters once the Third Reich invaded the Soviet Union and a gunner was deemed necessary to fend off hostile Luftwaffe aircraft. The first flight tests took place in October of 1939, 1 month after the Soviet-German invasion and occupation of Poland. Stalin and the Stavka were pleased with the aircraft, and it passed factory trials in 1940. Nevertheless, Ilyushin kept working to improve the design before mass production. The Ilyushin IL-2 Stromovik was armed with 5 7.62mm machine guns, one of which was used for defense, and 2 23mm cannons. In addition, the fuselage was tapered at the tail, where a single vertical fin was affixed, along with low-set horizontal planes with rounded tips. Both crewmen were seated back-to-back, and the engine compartment resulted in a long nose section where the cockpit had to be placed closer to midships. Eventually, the modifications to the glazing in which the rear gunner was seated led to the nickname of the Hunchback. The Ilyushin IL Stromovik, or Hunchback, entered production in March of 1941 as rumors of an invasion of the Soviet Union by German forces began to spread across Europe. By the time Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa on June 22, 1941, over 250 Hunchbacks had been produced, but very few were delivered to Soviet Air Force units close to the regions where the Axis attacked. Moreover, they were swiftly destroyed by the Luftwaffe because of the scarce training the Soviet pilots received. Even so, on June 21st, the 4th SHAP, or Ground Attack Regiment of the Soviet Air Force, conducted its first coordinated assault against a column of German panzers and mechanized infantry. Ensuing attacks were successful, but by the end of the summer, most Stromoviks were already destroyed, and production had to be ramped up. This initially proved difficult, as the entire Soviet industry had to be relocated beyond the Ural Mountains. As a result, the quality of the aircraft delivered between 1941 and 1942 varied significantly. Some had full metal fuselages and wings, but others were made with wood. Stalin was furious and sent a telegram to the directors of several IL-2 plants. He wrote, quote, "You have let down our country and our Red Army. You have the nerve not to manufacture IL-2s until now. Our Red Army now needs IL-2 aircraft, like the air it breathes, like the bread it eats. This plant now produces 1 IL-2 a day. It is a mockery of the Red Army. I ask you not to try the government's patience, and demand that you manufacture more IL-2s. This is my final warning." Production increased dramatically in the following years, and over 36,000 Stromoviks would be produced by the end of the war. The 2-seater Stromoviks were fitted with additional protective armor, 2 37mm cannons, and AM-38F engines that provided over 1,750 horsepower. This variant quickly displaced the 1-seater, as the Germans promptly exploited the disadvantage of lacking a rear gunner. Luftwaffe aircraft tended to attack the Soviet aircraft from above and behind to overwhelm them rapidly. In June of 1942, pilot Vasily Emelianenko and his squad of Stromoviks were dispatched to a German airfield near Artemovsk in eastern Ukraine to destroy as many enemy aircraft as possible. They were flying low in a ravine to avoid detection, and once the enemy airfield was spotted, the Stromoviks lined up in battle formation, going straight for the parked Luftwaffe aircraft. Emelianenko and his crew immediately fired their rockets and lined up their cannon shots as they passed over the rows of German warplanes. Soon, the Germans retaliated with machine gun fire, but the Sturmovik's rugged armor proved it could withstand the damage. Even so, the Soviet aircraft kept engaging the airfield until the Germans could take their aircraft to the skies. Sturmovik pilot and hero of the Soviet Union Valentin Averyanov wrote in his memoirs that, quote, "Despite the fact that the armor offered no protection from 20mm anti-aircraft rounds and aircraft guns, it still deflected many types of munitions. The Sturmovik's heavy armor would eventually lead the Germans to call the aircraft the Bettenflugzeug, or concrete plane." Such scenes were not uncommon, and they increased as the war's tide changed. During the last days of the Battle of Stalingrad, 2 Sturmoviks armed to the teeth wreaked havoc in the train station at Malorossiskaya, the Tigoretsk region. The 2 hunchbacks destroyed 4 trains, leading to countless German casualties and valuable losses of fuel, ammunition, and other supplies for the Axis forces. The Ilyushin IL-2 was finally proving its worth as a ground attack aircraft. In combination with its 7.62mm machine guns, 37mm cannons, and bomb load of over 1,300 pounds, the Sturmovik had no trouble tearing apart German Panzer IIIs and even Panthers. The introduction of anti-tank bomblets, or PTABs, further enhanced the anti-tank capabilities of the Sturmovik, as these small 5-pound armor-piercing bomblets easily penetrated German armor. During the Battle of Kursk, the Sturmoviks dropped the PTABs from altitudes of over 320 feet, with a damage zone that ranged from 50 to 230 feet. According to Soviet sources, over 70 enemy tanks from the 9th Panzer Division were destroyed by Sturmoviks in just 20 minutes. Moreover, General V. Ryazanov employed mass attacks on aircraft with the Circle of Death, or Wheel of Death tactic, forming defensive circles with 8 to 12 models. One fighter at a time could leave the circle to strike its targets and then head back to the formation to avoid being shot down by other Luftwaffe fighters. Overall, the Soviet Air Force claimed to have destroyed more than 250 German panzers during the skirmishes at Kursk. Several Sturmovik IL-2 pilots became heroes of the Soviet Union due to their war exploits. Such was the case of Lieutenant Colonel Nelson Stepyan, who flew over 240 combat sorties and destroyed over 70 tanks, 500 armored vehicles, and 20 aircraft. Soviet commander Leonid Beda also made a name for himself after assaulting Sapun Hill near Sevastopol with his squadron of Sturmoviks. Beda and his men flew just 20 feet above the ground to hide from German anti-aircraft guns. They then approached enemy emplacements and ships to destroy them with their bomb load. And Senior Lieutenant Anna Yegorova became an icon after flying more than 240 missions and earning the Gold Star of the USSR. Despite its effectiveness, Sturmovik losses were extremely high during the war. Of the 36,000 produced, over 15,000 were lost at the hands of the Germans. The surviving hunchbacks were eventually supplied to countries that joined the USSR during the post-war, but it was quickly phased out with the introduction of Soviet jet aircraft. The legacy of this Russian ground attack aircraft lives on today with the Sukhoi Su-25 Frogfoot, the answer to the American A-10 Thunderbolt II. By 1943, the Pacific Theater was in full swing, with the Allies forcefully attempting to take over the prized islands occupied by the relentless Japanese Empire. Using the obtained experience during the war and learning from their mistakes, the Japanese Air Force officials sought to build one last aircraft that could help them turn the tide of the war in their favor. Enter the Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate. Widely considered the finest Japanese fighter to operate in large numbers during the long conflict, this single-engine aircraft would leave a strong mark with the 11th Sentai Air Group by coming face-to-face with the North American Mustangs and having enough firepower to take down the iconic Boeing B-29 Superfortresses. The fast and versatile model quickly gained a reputation as a combat aircraft to be reckoned with, taking the United States Army Air Forces entirely by surprise. In early 1942, just as the Nakajima Ki-43 Hayabusa tactical fighter was entering service with the Imperial Japanese Army Air Service, the nation's war planners began looking for its replacement. Nakajima engineers mapped out a new aircraft plan, recognizing a need to combine the Hayabusa's maneuverability with improved firepower and performance to match the best Western fighters. The result was the Ki-84 Hayate. A single-seat fighter, the Hayate, Japanese for Gale, was a cantilever low-wing monoplane with a slender and conventional-looking fuselage. A scarcity of aluminum plagued Japan at the time, and the earliest models were made of metal. However, the Ki-84's rear and other components were built with wood, covered with a thick coat of lacquer. The Hayate's cockpit provided excellent visibility, and the windshield used armored glass for pilot protection. Powered by a single 1,800 horsepower fuel-injected Homare HA-45 radial engine, its motor was the equivalent of the American-made Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine. The Ki-84 could reach a maximum speed of 387 miles per hour and almost 500 when diving. With an endurance of 1.5 hours and a range of 250 miles, the Hayate could climb 16,405 feet in 6 minutes 26 seconds, and it was considered an easy plane to fly, making it ideal for training. As for its armament, the fighter had 2 fuselage-mounted synchronized machine guns and 2 wing-mounted cannons, an improvement over the 2 smaller machines of its predecessor. In addition, its defensive armor offered Hayate pilots more protection, as the Ki-84 used a 2.56-inch armored glass canopy, 0.51 inches of head and back armor, and multiple bulkheads in the fuselage. Such heavy armor also shielded the fuel and methanol water tanks, used for emergency power in case of an attack. Deliveries of the Ki-84 from Nakajima's Ota factory began 1 month after its inaugural flight in March of 1943. Even so, Japan's newest fighter didn't enter combat in China with the 22nd Air Regiment until late the following year. Ultimately, the aircraft's total production would surpass 3,500. As the aircraft rolled out of the factories, the type began arriving at the Tokorozawa Airport, located 30 miles from Tokyo. Initially built in 1911, the facilities were used by the Japanese Empire in both World Wars. The historic airport was the headquarters of the Army Aviation Research and Development Center of the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force, as well as the home to a technical and logistics center where Sentai air groups were sent to adjust to new aircraft types, train with them, and get ready for battle. One of them was the 11th Sentai, one of Japan's oldest and most distinguished air groups. With some of the most experienced pilots in its ranks, the 11th Sentai operated in the China-Burma-India theater between the summer of 1942 and the spring of 1944, fighting against the Allies in the skies above the prized Solomon Islands. The unit had been ordered to withdraw back to Japan for re-equipment and reorganization a few months earlier, and the plan was to switch from their Ki-43-2 Hayabusas to Ki-84s. Soon after arriving at the Tokorozawa airfield, most of the most experienced pilots were transferred to other units, this time appointed as squadron commanders. Some became aerial combat instructors, while others were too ill or exhausted to continue fighting. By the summer, only the core of the 11th Sentai's cadre remained at the base, supplemented with hastily trained rookies. For the novices of the 11th Sentai Air Group, the transition to the Hayate was not easy. And to make matters worse, the Koku Hombu, the air headquarters of the Imperial Army, did not know where and how to use the reorganized unit. After discussions with the Japanese Homeland Air Defense, the team was sent to Formosa, or modern-day Taiwan, and the 11th would be moved once again when the American invasion of the Japanese-occupied Philippines kicked off in October. Early that month, 40 Hayates from the 11th Sentai, marked with a red lightning bolt, departed Japan under the command of Major Yoshihiro Kanaya. However, several Ki-84s had to return to base because of technical reasons, and another 2 disappeared while flying over the ocean. Only about 30 Hayate fighters made it to Yilan Airport in Taiwan. During the planning of the invasion of the Philippines, U.S. intelligence determined that between the Philippines, Taiwan, Okinawa, and southern Kyushu bases, Japan had a force of 1,200 aircraft, including the Ki-84, referred to as Frank in the West. To neutralize these massive forces, the United States Navy sent Task Force 38. With dozens of vessels of many kinds, the American party boasted nearly 1,000 aircraft. On October 12th, the task force, aided by a B-29 formation attack from China, crashed down on the Japanese. Meanwhile, the 11th Sentai was kept in reserves and was sent into combat only during the final phase of the battle against Allied aircraft retreating to their floating airfield. Soon, a brutal clash between a considerable force of F-6F Hellcats and 25 Hayates ensued. While the Americans suffered significant losses, including 3 fighters and 3 pilots, the price the Japanese paid was costly. 6 Ki-84s were taken down, and 2 more had to desert the battle after being hit. Most of the remaining fighters were damaged beyond control, presenting a severe problem due to a lack of spare parts. Following such dire results, the command of the 11th Sentai was assumed by Captain Yuji Mizuguchi. Even as the initial results of the Ki-84s had exceeded all expectations, catching the American Army Air Force's pilots entirely off guard, and being particularly strong at intercepting high-flying B-29 Superfortress bombers, the aircraft started showing signs of weaknesses as the fight against the Allies got increasingly desperate. By late 1944, growing difficulties in securing skilled pilots and getting proper fuel and adequate construction materials often prevented it from reaching its full potential. On October 20th, the United States Sixth Army began landing on Leyte, and 2 days later, the 11th Sentai engaged them. However, the group's fighters were no longer the vital force that had left Japan 2 weeks before, and their first combat mission over the archipelago was a failure. Soon after, the Ki-84s were tasked with defending critical areas near Manila, while naval air forces were engaged in the battle for Leyte Gulf. The Hayates then encountered several P-838 Lightning and P-47 Thunderbolts, losing 3 more aircraft. As November approached, the group only had 3 combat-worthy fighters and was thus reinforced by the 1st Sentai. They touched down on Clark Field in the Philippines, but only half of the 40 Hayates that took off from Japan made it. Consequently, they were sent to the nearby and much less exposed Porac airfield. By mid-December, the group was sent on a mission against the Allied-occupied port and airfield of San Jose on the island of Mindoro. The fight proved to be one of the last major wins for the Japanese Ki-84s, as the 11th lost no aircraft, while one sunk a troop transport and seriously damaged another. Ultimately, avoiding the massive Allied bombing campaign became impossible, and the resources were scarce, significantly affecting the Hayate's production. By January 9, 1945, the 11th Sentai did not have any combat-worthy Ki-84s left. In early March 1945, the last remaining survivors of the 11th Sentai arrived at Takahagi on the Kanto Plain in Japan. While the original plans called for the once elite unit to be rebuilt, most aircraft and their young pilots were soon sent to kamikaze units to provide support in the last days of the Battle of Okinawa. That would be the final nail in the coffin for the 11th, and the once famous Sentai never flew again. Following the Japanese surrender in the summer of 1945, the Allied soldiers found a damaged and abandoned Hayate on the outskirts of Clark Field. Marked with the number 46, the model was taken by the Americans and transported to the United States. For decades, the model bounced from owner to owner until it was restored to flying condition and returned to Japan in 1973. However, neglect and stolen parts would prevent it from flying again, and in 1991, the only surviving Ki-84 of World War II was transferred to the Tokuheiwa Kinenkan Museum, Kagoshima Prefecture, where it is still displayed. In the end, the Nakajima Ki-84 single-seat fighter is remembered as one of the best Japanese fighters to operate during World War II, matching the Allied forces like no other. However, the type entered the conflict far too late in the game to make any significant impact on the outcome of the war. As the Battle of Britain raged in the skies above the English Channel throughout the summer and fall of 1940, RAF pilot officer D.H. Nobby Clark was ready to play his part in fighting off the Nazi invasion of his homeland, the last Allied hope in Europe. Day after day, British Hurricanes and Spitfires bravely dueled with German Messerschmitt Bf-109s, but pilot officer Clark, prepared to serve king and country, was given a different kind of mission in a very different kind of aircraft. At 5:30 p.m. on September 26th, Clark was already airborne in his unwieldy Blackburn Rock, which had shown itself to be ineffective as a fighter, but made for a trusty search and rescue aircraft, when he received a report of British airmen being shot down off the coast of the Isle of Wight. With intrepid gunner Sergeant Hunt in tow, Clark bounded towards the search area, determined to arrive on time to rescue his countrymen from the chilly waters below. Arriving at the scene, the pair desperately scanned the ocean for survivors, their eyes straining against the rapidly encroaching darkness. 45 minutes passed with no luck. The only other sign of life was the faint outline of a friendly swordfish seaplane in the distance, probably engaged in a similar search and rescue mission. But as the two aircraft drew nearer, Clark noticed something was amiss. The size, the markings, it just didn't add up. Going in for a closer look, his suspicions were confirmed. They had stumbled upon a German Heinkel HE-59 seaplane, out to save its own downed comrades. Clark's awkward and slow-moving rock was all he had, and he was about to put it to the test in what would become one of World War II's most bizarre showdowns. Despite the controversy surrounding the Blackburn Rock's design, there were logical principles behind it. The Rock was an example of a turret fighter, an aircraft whose armament consisted of one or more machine guns mounted on a flexible turret, as opposed to having fixed weapons that could only fire frontwards. The advantages of this were twofold. Not only did it allow the fighter to defend itself against attacks from various angles, including the rear, but it also provided for an aiming technique known as no-allowance shooting. A fighter with front-firing guns would have to position itself in such a way that it could aim not at where the enemy aircraft was at that moment, but where it would be by the time the bullets reached it, known as deflection shooting. This would become even more complicated if the aircraft were pulling hard turns, as the angle would require the attacking fighter to pull its nose and shoot at a target that it couldn't even see. By contrast, through the use of a gun that could be angled upwards, a turret fighter could aim directly at a turning target, making it far easier to achieve a hit. During World War I, turret fighters had been used to great effect by the British, as models like the Bristol F-2 fighter and the Airco DH-4 proved invaluable for protecting reconnaissance planes from airborne attacks by the German enemy. However, the turret fighters of the early 1930s, such as the Hawker Demon, would start showing signs of trouble. As aircraft got faster, the force of the slipstream increased, making it far more difficult to operate the guns. The addition of a protective shield went some way to improving the Demon gunner's ability to hit the target, but when the turret was pointed to the side, the accuracy of the two fixed guns was severely affected. Nevertheless, the British Air Ministry remained committed to producing turret fighters. On December 31, 1935, the Air Ministry officially began the search for a carrier-based turret-armed fighter for the Fleet Air Arm, the aviation component of the Royal Navy. Headed by G.E. Petty, the Yorkshire-based Blackburn aircraft design team immediately got to work developing a turret fighter variation of their brand-new Skua dive bomber, which would eventually become the Rock. Just like the Skua, the Rock would be a low-wing cantilever monoplane, boasting an all-metal construction and a two-seater configuration. It would come with a retractable tailwheel undercarriage, providing good ground handling and reduced drag during flight, as well as folding wings for ease of storage on aircraft carriers, where space was often limited. What's more, it would keep the Skua's wing-mounted dive brakes, which had been shown to improve maneuverability, accuracy, and safety. Both aircraft would use Bristol Perseus engines to drive their three-blade propellers and contained marine equipment in the rear fuselage, including a collapsible dinghy for emergency operations on water. However, Petty's team also tried to give the Rock some advantages over the Skua. They used a different mainplane with a slight dihedral, eliminating the need for upturned wingtips, which tended to cause drag and reduce efficiency. They also added attachment points for a float undercarriage, giving it the ability to land and take off from water surfaces. The Rock's hydraulically powered Fraser-Nash turret could rotate in any direction, and by using a control column, its four electrically fired 303-inch Browning machine guns would allow its gunner to blast rounds into enemy aircraft at angles as high as 85 degrees above the horizon. It also featured an integrated automatic interruption to avoid hitting its own propeller or tail unit. Rounding out its arsenal, the Rock's underwing racks were loaded with two 250-pound bombs and 8 30-pound bombs. Crucially, however, it didn't have any front-firing guns, meaning it would have to rely entirely on its turret in a dogfight situation. As Blackburn was busy working on the design for the Rock in the West Midlands, rival company Boulton Paul put together a proposal for their own turret fighter. Known as the P-85, it was designed as a naval version of the land-based P-82, soon to be christened the Defiant. Although this new Sea Defiant was expected to be capable of speeds over 300 miles per hour, the Air Ministry inexplicably rejected it in favor of the Rock, which could only manage a maximum of 223 miles per hour, placing an off-the-drawing-board order for 136 units on April 28, 1937. Adding insult to injury, Boulton Paul was then subcontracted for the production of the Rock, forcing them to delay the production of the Defiant. Pilot H.J. Wilson took the prototype Rock out on its maiden flight on December 23, 1938. Though it showed good handling, there was much concern about its disappointing top speed. There were also serious problems with the planned conversion that would allow the Rock to operate as a float plane. The first kit trialed caused severe instability, and while the second one managed to partially fix the issue by adding an enlarged ventral fin, it dropped the Rock's maximum speed even further to 193 miles per hour. Navy officials began casting doubts on the Rock's viability, with 5th Sea Lord Alexander Ramsey, Chief of Naval Air Services, suggesting that the project should be abandoned. While skeptical about the Rock's abilities in combat situations, the Air Ministry was reluctant to cancel production. They wanted to avoid further disrupting Boulton Paul's production schedule. As the potential outbreak of war was becoming more and more likely, the Fleet Air Arm couldn't afford to wait around for an alternative. As World War II got underway, the Rock's shortcomings were quickly noted, especially as it typically flew side by side with the more adept Skua. When the 803rd Naval Air Squadron was assigned Rocks for its mission to protect the Royal Naval Base at Scapa Flow in northern Scotland, the squadron leader complained that the Rocks were constantly slowing them down and asked to trade them in for more Skuas instead. In the spring of 1940, the Rock's inadequacy was made further apparent in the Allies' failed Norwegian campaign, as time and time again it was unable to provide effective resistance against the German invaders. But the Rock was not ready to be written off just yet. On May 28th of that year, during the evacuations of Dunkirk, pilot midshipman A.G. Day, flying his Rock alongside 2 Skuas as part of the 806th Naval Air Squadron, suddenly came face to face with 5 Junkers Ju-88s attacking a British convoy near Ostend in Belgium. As the Skuas soared over the German aircraft to launch a scorching attack from above, Day dipped below them so his gunner could take full advantage of his turret-mounted Brownings and give the enemy an unwanted introduction to the famous no-allowance shooting. Launching an intense flurry of bullets skyward, the plucky Rock sent one unfortunate Ju-88 plummeting toward the sea below in a cloud of smoke. Satisfied with his victory, Day was able to head back to the safety of the RAF base at Detling. The Blackburn Rock's victory at Dunkirk was not enough to convince naval authorities of its value as a fighter, and while it participated in bombing attacks on Boulogne and Camp Gris-Nez during June 1946, it soon found itself reassigned to air-sea rescue and target towing roles. Yet circumstances would soon conspire to give the Rock an unexpected shot at aerial combat heroism. As a member of the 2nd Anti-Aircraft Cooperation Unit, abbreviated to 2AACU, Pilot Officer D.H. Nobby Clark was assigned Blackburn Rock L3805, which he duly customized by painting a red saint from the Leslie Charteris novels in a red-framed yellow diamond on either side of the rear fuselage of the aircraft. Clark was part of the search and rescue operation designed to save the lives of RAF pilots shot down in the Battle of Britain. The afternoon of September 26 was drawing to a close when a muffled voice came over the radio to inform Clark about downed pilots in need of assistance approximately 15 miles southwest of St. Catherine's Point, the southernmost tip of the Isle of Wight. Without a moment's delay, he and his gunner, Sergeant Hunt, set off to find them, but a search of 3/4 of an hour proved fruitless. Becoming aware of what looked like a swordfish seaplane around 3 miles away, he assumed it was part of a fellow British search and rescue mission. However, as the 2 planes gradually got closer to one another, he soon realized his mistake, noticing that it was, in fact, a twin-engine float plane. Approaching the aircraft to get a closer look, he was soon able to identify it as a German Henkel HE-59. Doubts raced through his mind. The Henkel was probably also out to save survivors. He hesitated to engage it in a fight. His dilemma was soon answered for him when the Nazi float plane opened fire first. As Clark narrowly dodged bullets from the Henkel's 7.99mm machine gun, Hunt returned fire, sending a tracer flying into the Henkel's fuselage. The least likely dogfight of World War II was underway. The excitement of the unexpected skirmish resulted in Hunt's intercom lead being pulled out, but the two were able to re-establish communication in time to plan their next move. As the Hinkle retreated towards France, barely skimming the tops of the waves, the Blackburn Rock went in hot pursuit. Once ridiculed for its sluggish pace, it now found itself outrunning the Hinkle, which could barely manage a top speed of 137 miles per hour as it desperately tried to escape. Closing in to 300 yards, Clark dropped a wing, the Rock's propeller perilously close to the waves as Hunt fired off another broadside. The Hinkle retaliated from its 3 gun positions, bullets blazing dangerously close. Yet Clark's skillful piloting kept the Rock dancing just above the water, evading the worst of the enemy's fire. For a tense 25 minutes, the pair of lumbering rescue aircraft found themselves locked in a deadly duel, exchanging savage bursts of gunfire as if they were heroic flying aces. Neither of the two escaped damage, yet neither was able to overpower its rival. Clark heard one of the Hinkle's gunners fall silent, but realizing they were rapidly approaching the French coastline, he prepared to turn away before having to face the threat of Nazi anti-aircraft weapons. Just as it seemed the battle was over, the Rock was shaken by a direct hit on its engine, which began sputtering ominously. With quick thinking, Clark switched to the 17-gallon reserve fuel tank, coaxing the wounded aircraft skyward. Knowing it would only get so far, he began thinking about ditching, but just at that moment, the engine sprung back to life, and he was successfully able to nurse it back to Gosport Airfield. Before the Rock could taxi in, its engine coughed its last breath, drained of fuel. Barely able to believe what had happened, Clark and Hunt now had a claim for a damaged Hinkle under their belts, yet it soon became apparent that things could have gone a lot differently. Upon inspection, the ground crew made the shocking discovery of 2 incendiary bullets floating in the main fuel tank, just underneath Clark's seat. Fortunately, they had entered low down in the fuel, which had extinguished them before they'd had a chance to do any damage. A few inches higher, and the tank would have exploded. Clark and Hunt didn't realize just how close they'd come to being blown to oblivion. It was a fitting ending for a surreal evening. While the Blackburn Rock's dogfight with the Hinkle had certainly provided a surprising story, it didn't go any way to persuading British Naval Air Services of its abilities. Its use was limited to far-off locations such as Bermuda before the last of its kind were finally withdrawn from service in June 1943. Despite being based on solid theory, in practice it simply wasn't up to the standards of the other fighters of its day. Yet Pilot Officer Clark's peculiar combat encounter will forever be remembered as one of the strangest moments of World War II. When the hastily built Lavochkin LA-5 fighter first soared into the aerial arena in July 1943, German pilots waved it off as inconsequential. They even condescendingly nicknamed it the Neue Ratte, as if it were just another iteration of the Soviet Union's outdated Polikarpov I-16s that saw action in the Spanish Civil War. Within 24 hours, that complacency was shattered. The Luftwaffe pilots quickly gained a newfound respect and a touch of fear for the LA-5. Against a crumbling Eastern Front, the hastily built Lavochkin LA-5 fighter emerged as more than a quick fix. It was a pivotal force that swung the air war in favor of the Red Air Force. Above the tank-lined fields and smoke-filled air, the battle for aerial supremacy over Kursk delivered a stern warning. Underestimate the LA-5 at your own peril. When Germany first attacked the Soviet Union in June 1941, the LAGG-3 was one of the Russian Air Force's main fighters. While it had good armament, the type failed spectacularly in initial clashes with Third Reich aircraft due to its underpowered engine, excessive weight, and poor performance. Failing to meet expectations, Soviet pilots disdained the fighter and branded it a heavy beast with a weak core. Before long, they had rebranded LAGG, initially short for Lavochkin Gorbunov Gudkov, as an acronym for Lakirovanny Garantirovanny Grob, a varnished guaranteed coffin. Facing immense pressure on the Eastern Front as German forces advanced deep into Soviet territory, Russian officials came to a grim realization. Their military was ill-equipped and poorly trained to counter the now perfected blitzkrieg. To avoid the fate of many other European countries, the Soviets urgently needed to update their air fleet to challenge the German Luftwaffe. By the fall of 1941, factories making the LAGG-3 shifted to producing the more favored Yakovlev Yik-1s and Yik-7s. In December, Fyodor Dementyev, deputy commissar of the aviation industry, bluntly informed Director Semyon Lavochkin that he had fallen from government favor and needed to act quickly, stating, quote, The storm is coming down on you. Your days are numbered. Now, you must take extraordinary steps to completely change the attitude of the military and the government towards the LAGG-3. With the very existence of the Design Bureau and his honor now in question, that winter, Lavochkin began work unofficially to improve the LAGG-3, conducting most of the design work in a small hut next to an airfield. Once hard at work, Arkady Shvetsov, another engineer at the Bureau, suggested equipping the LAGG-3 aircraft with his ASH-82FN M82 air-cooled radial engine to add the much-needed power. A license-built version of the renowned Wright 1820 Cyclone radial engine, this 14-cylinder M82 could generate 1,850 horsepower, significantly improving upon the model used in the failing aircraft. This new engine would propel the aircraft to a maximum speed of 400 miles per hour and provide a range of around 475 miles. Agreeing to this proposal, Lavochkin, with Vladimir Gorbunov's help, started exploring ways to attach a radial engine to an airframe designed for an inline engine. However, this posed no simple task. For one, the M82 weighed over 500 pounds more and was wider, affecting the aircraft's center of gravity. To resolve this, the Soviet engineers took the nose section from a Sukhoi Su-2 light bomber already housing an M82 and grafted it onto an LAGG-3. While issues in fine-tuning remained to be solved, the trick of attaching a radial engine to the unpopular and underperforming fighter succeeded. The rest of the changes to the model marked a departure from Lavochkin's earlier aircraft designs. Unlike most models where the cockpit sits up front near the engine, the LA-5 had its cockpit in the middle. This mid-positioning, coupled with a trimmed-down rear fuselage, influenced the aircraft's center of gravity, aerodynamics, and pilot visibility. One standout feature of this aircraft was its prominent propeller hub, an eye-catcher and a recurring design element in Lavochkin's subsequent aircraft models. However, other aspects, like the LAGG-3's basic structure and layout, remained largely unchanged. The prototype of the Lavochkin LA-5 made its first flight in March 1942 to extremely positive results. The change from LAGG to LA was because one of the original Bureau designers, Mikhail Gudkov, was no longer with the program. Besides the engineers being well pleased with the new fighter's performance, Soviet test pilots quickly declared this new aircraft superior to the Yakovlev Yak-7. Intensive flight training started in April, and by July, as attacks on Soviet territory escalated, Stalin himself ordered the LA-5 into full production, including the conversion of all unfinished LAGG-3 airframes to accommodate the new air-cooled engines. Further refinement of this model gave rise to the LA-5FN, the definitive version of the aircraft. The LA-5 series went from prototype to production almost instantly, aligning with the no-nonsense Soviet mentality that any aircraft is better than none. Fortunately for the Soviet Air Force, the LA-5 proved to be more than an adequate aircraft. It became a versatile and powerful heavy hitter, capable of matching many Luftwaffe fighters pound for pound. Introduced to VVS squadrons in 1942, the Lavochkin LA-5 saw its inaugural combat during the early phases of the Battle of Stalingrad that summer. There, it supplied air cover for Soviet ground troops and battled Luftwaffe aircraft above the beleaguered city. Pilots quickly favored the new model, praising it as a substantial upgrade over its predecessor. They particularly liked the LA-5FN variant, equipped with a fuel-injected engine and other enhancements. As 1942 transitioned into 43, the Eastern Front became a relentless war of attrition. Far from quickly subduing the Soviets, as they had other nations, the Germans were increasingly stretched thin, struggling to sustain control over the immense territories they had seized. The Wehrmacht's reversal at Stalingrad signaled the beginning of a shifting tide in favor of the Soviets. In an effort to regain the initiative and definitively crush the Red Army, the German High Command orchestrated Operation Citadel, focusing their might on the Kursk salient for a large-scale assault. It was at Kursk, the setting for history's largest tank battle, where the LA-5, now more advanced and battle-hardened than ever, would earn its first major victory. On July 5, 1943, at the end of the first day of combat in the Battle of Kursk, instead of tanks, Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin was focused on another branch that he knew would affect the outcome of this battle. During a meeting where one of his commanders, Konstantin Rokossovsky, recounted the day's action, Stalin interrupted and said, quote, "Do we have control of the air or not?" Rokossovsky promised the Soviet premier they would gain control of the skies the next day. On July 6th, the second day of the Battle of Kursk, the Germans, deploying all available resources, intensified their efforts to breach Soviet defenses. Their most dangerous asset was the Junkers Ju-87 bomber. According to Soviet accounts, these bombers could penetrate even the most robust defense lines. One soldier reported, quote, "No matter how perfect our defense was, no matter how deeply our infantrymen burrowed into the ground, the Junkers bombs punched holes in any position." The time had come to challenge the Junkers' aerial supremacy. Early in the day, the Luftwaffe had maintained air dominance, but Soviet pilots, some flying LA-5s, started shifting the balance. Armed with twin 20mm SHVAK cannons in the engine cowling, the LA-5 started to contest the German air superiority as the battle unfolded. The Germans quickly realized that the new Lavochkin model, when piloted by a skilled Soviet airman, was as much a threat as any other force on the battlefield. One of these exploits has since become legendary. Deputy Commander Guard Senior Lieutenant Alexander K. Horovets of the 1st Squadron, 88th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment, found his patrol mission boring and uneventful. At the time, he was under strict orders to save all his ammunition for attacking Junkers. As Horovets and his team flew back to base, 2 Me-109s unexpectedly ambushed the squadron. When his wingman, Reynoff, broke off to engage the enemy fighters, pilot Horovets spotted a formation of Junkers bombers closing in rapidly on their lines. With his heart racing and his radio malfunctioning, Horovets had to make a snap decision. With his wingman lost in a dogfight, this left him isolated. Breaking away from his team, he aimed his LA-5 at the lead bomber. The roar of his 20mm SHVAK cannons filled the air as the first Junker spiraled downwards, engulfed in flames. Without hesitating, Horovets targeted the next bomber and the next, setting 2 more ablaze and sending the German formation into chaos. Valiantly, Horovets continued the engagement, accounting for an outstanding 8 enemy aircraft in total. When he realized his ammunition was spent, the brave Soviet pilot did the unthinkable. Using his plane's propeller, he struck the tail of a 9th bomber. But the tide turned as he tried to return to his damaged airstrip when a group of enemy FW-190s cornered him. Despite his best evasive maneuvers, his LA-5 took critical hits. Realizing the situation, Horovets attempted to eject and deploy his parachute, but failed to do so. As such, his plane crash-landed in a field. For his bravery, Alexander K. Horovets posthumously received the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. In a similar vein, later that month, and also over the skies northeast of Kursk, LA-5 pilots took down veteran Luftwaffe aces Major Reinhard Zeiler and Lieutenant Hugo Hunnerfeld, both piloting FW-190s. These episodes in the skies over Kursk made it clear that in record time and under immense pressure, the Soviet Union had developed an aircraft that could match and in many ways exceed the capabilities of their own German fighters. During that same summer, a Soviet T-34 tanks decisively defeated the German army in just 50 days at the Battle of Kursk. A new LA-5FN made an emergency landing on a Luftwaffe airfield. This event, not uncommon in World War II, gave the Wehrmacht a chance to thoroughly analyze one of the latest additions to the Soviet Air Force's arsenal. The findings were eye-opening. The captured plane was shipped to Germany for thorough testing at the Luftwaffe Research Center in Rechlin. There, renowned German test pilot Hans Werner Lerche chronicled his experiences flying the LA-5FN. According to his account, the aircraft excelled at altitudes below 9,800 feet, exhibiting performance on par with Luftwaffe planes. Lerche also noted that this new Lavochkin model had superior maneuverability in certain areas. However, German aircraft outperformed it at higher elevations. Among the shortcomings Lerche identified were the LA-5FN's complex engine controls, Each function in the cockpit operated with its own separate lever, compelling the pilot to make frequent adjustments during flight, a challenging task in already stressful situations. In contrast, contemporary German aircraft featured integrated controls, allowing pilots to manage multiple settings with a single lever. Lercher also noted that the aircraft's flight duration was extremely limited, lasting only about 40 minutes at cruising speed. Despite these drawbacks, Hans Werner Lercher's analysis concluded that the Li-5FN indeed represented a significant improvement over earlier Soviet aircraft that had contended with the Luftwaffe. When facing the German Luftwaffe, the Li-5FN proved as lethal as any other aircraft, ultimately securing air superiority over the Eastern Front. From Kursk to Berlin, the fighter consistently played a critical role within the Soviet Air Force. The Lavochkin La-5 symbolized the Soviet Union's industrial and military resurgence in 1943. This momentum propelled the Red Army and VVS all the way to Berlin in 1945. One of the most successful La-5 units was the VVS's 5th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment. This unit flew nearly 4,000 combat sorties, claimed 128 enemy aircraft shot down, and lost only 52 Lavochkins. Ivan Kozhedub, the Soviet Union's top ace, scored the majority of his 64 victories piloting his La-5FN. Despite this, La-5 suffered high losses, the highest among all fighters in service with the USSR, except for the Yak-1. Initial production yielded a total of 5,048 Lavochkins in 1943. Another 3,826 were built in 1944, though this number dwindled when production of the upgraded La-7 commenced in April. The Lavochkin La-7, introduced in September 1944, was a direct evolution of the La-5 series, specifically its last variant, the La-5FN. The transition was driven by a need for enhanced performance, reliability, and combat effectiveness. This change was also encouraged by the availability of superior materials and advancements in aviation technology, enabling a more efficient design. Historical records indicate that once the La-7 proved superior, La-5 production completely shifted to the newer model by November of that same year. As the skies over Europe were dotted with searing dogfights and devastating aerial raids, U.S. engineers waged their own battle with each other in a fierce competition to build the next great American fighter, one that could shift the tides of the war. Bell Aircraft was no different, and it aggressively sought to turn its failed P-39 Airacobra design into the basis for a groundbreaking fighter. Months of excruciating days and sleepless nights ensued, resulting in the Bell P-63 King Cobra, a fast, agile fighter that improved everything from the rejected P-39. However, weeks before being completed, North American unveiled its newest P-51 Mustang variation, one with a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine inside its hull, shattering the future of Bell's new creation in its intended role. Even so, the King Cobra's influence in the conflict was far from over. Like its forerunner, it would find a niche under a different air force and flag. Combat aviation design during World War II was a fast-paced and wild new frontier, with emerging technology bursting into the scene faster than aviation manufacturers could build new warplanes. Bell Aviation had the fortune of finishing one of its most promising designs just as the war was about to begin, which gave its aircraft an excellent opportunity to become the backbone of the United States Army Air Forces, or USAAF. The innovative proposal would be known as the Bell P-39 Airacobra. With its maiden flight in 1938 and its introduction to the USAAF, the Airacobra was one of the newest fighters in service by the time the US was dragged into World War II. Nimble and fast, the P-39 was a cutting-edge aircraft that brought many promising configuration features to combat aviation. It was unique among contemporary fighters in that its engine was located behind the cockpit, allowing for a powerful, oversized cannon to be mounted in the nose of the aircraft. But as impressive as its specifications were before the war, as soon as the conflict started and arms races across the globe were pushed into overdrive, Newer and more powerful designs towered over the Aerocobra's capabilities. The USAAF was not impressed with the capabilities of the P-39, especially its poor high-altitude performance, and decided that the Aerocobra did not have what was needed to become the United States' leading fighter aircraft. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, one nation expressed interest in Bell's aircraft, and as early as 1940 asked to purchase many of them. The Soviet Union got its wish, and after the Lend-Lease Act was passed in 1941, it began receiving hundreds of units. The fighter would go on to play a stellar role in the conflict. Just as its predecessor was being flown into battle by Soviet pilots, a new aircraft design based on the airframe of the Aerocobra was being devised by Bell Aircraft. By then, the USAAF was still using some Aerocobra units as ground attack and reconnaissance aircraft. The military branch believed, as did Bell, that with some significant modifications, the core design of the P-39 could become the high-altitude powerhouse that the US was looking for. As such, the USAAF requested Bell 3 new prototypes in 1941, designed and built for high-altitude combat and long-range operation. One of the main issues that had to be addressed was the P-39's poor high-altitude performance due to its modest engine and lack of a turbocharger. The new prototypes were designed to fit the still-in-development Continental I-1430 engine, which featured an improved overall design developed from the Hyper-Engine initiative and an improved supercharger. However, the Continental engine was nowhere near completion, and the prototypes had to be fitted with the Allison V1710-47, a machine similar to the one inside the P-39. The 3 Bell prototypes showcased various wing and tail configurations. These ranged from a rounded vertical tail with squared-off tailplane tips to a squared-off fin and rudder with large wing fillets. There was even a version with all of its flight surfaces squared off. The results, however, were all equally disappointing, with none of the prototypes performing better than their predecessor. Even so, the USAAF was interested in developing an even larger aircraft based on the same basic layout. In fact, before the P-39 had even flown, the USAAF placed an order for 2 prototypes of an enlarged version of the Aerocobra. These prototypes were designated the XP-63. Additionally, a 3rd prototype was ordered, which would be powered by the Packard V1650 engine, the US-built version of the Rolls-Royce Merlin. These enlarged prototypes would become the first P-63 King Cobras in the world. Bell Aviation was being pressured by the USAAF to deliver a more capable and stable fighter that was larger, faster, and more reliable than its previous design, the Aerocobra. However, the prototypes also suffered from external issues, which they could do little about. Bell had agreed to build a King Cobra with a Packard V1650 engine, but the drive was never delivered. As such, the USAAF began reserving the technology for the P-51B Mustangs, a new version of the plane that exceeded every expectation. At that point, Bell not only had to impress the USAAF, but also surpass the performance of the new Mustang variant. The XP-63 was a larger version of the Aerocobra with a redesigned wing, featuring new NACA laminar flow airfoils and a larger 4-bladed propeller. The engine was fitted with a second remotely mounted supercharger, and the P-63A was ordered into production in September of 1942, with delivery scheduled to start a year later. On December 7, 1942, the first prototype of the XP-63 had its maiden flight. However, the aircraft was destroyed on January 28th when its landing gear failed to extend. The second prototype took its first flight on February 5, 1943, but was also destroyed due to engine failure. And the third prototype, serial 4278015, was delivered with an Allison 93 engine, as the Merlin drive was reserved for the Mustang. This prototype was one of the fastest King Cobras built, reaching a top speed of 421 miles per hour at 24,100 feet, with a war emergency rating of 1,500 horsepower at sea level. Nevertheless, despite all of Bell's efforts, their new model was doomed to repeat its predecessor's fate. By this time, the USAAF had concluded that the King Cobra was inferior to the Mustang in high-altitude performance, range, and armament, and declined to order more. Ironically, even when Bell had been focused on improving the P-39's high-altitude performance when building the P-63, it showcased similar limitations in high-altitude aerial combat, which limited its effectiveness in specific roles. The US, which was looking for an aircraft capable of escorting its high-flying bombers to Germany, quickly opted for the much more capable Mustang. Faced with being outclassed, Bell's King Cobra was eventually degraded to a second-class fighter, mainly used for ground attack roles. While the US was mainly concerned with a powerful fighter capable of escorting its strategic bombers, the Soviet Union was waging a much more savage and tactical conflict on their territory and desperately needed a ground attack fighter. After their favorable experience with the Airacobra, the Soviets opted to seek its more powerful successor and placed a large order of King Cobras. Before they were delivered to the USSR, the aircraft were tested extensively by veteran Soviet test pilot Andrei G. Kochetkov, an authority in probing airframe spin characteristics. His feedback led to a series of vital adjustments on all the units delivered to the Red Army. In 1944, the P-63s were transported from Nome, Alaska to the USSR under the condition that the American-made aircraft would not be deployed against Nazi Germany on Russia's Western Front. Stalin had agreed to this condition, and the planes were only intended to be used against Japan, which the USSR was about to declare war on. However, once the warplanes were delivered, Stalin showed minimal regard for the agreement and began replacing some P-39 squadrons with the new aircraft. Several Luftwaffe records depict their pilots clashing against P-63s in the skies over East Prussia, while in official Soviet records, most aviation regiments were still flying King Cobras, passing as Airacobras. Under the control of Soviet pilots, the King Cobra became a rugged and capable fighter that saw some action in the conflict, especially during the short Soviet-Japanese War of 1945. However, records of most of its combat feats were drastically reduced, as the Soviet Union made it an official policy to downplay the role aircraft of foreign design had on their war efforts in favor of their own domestic warplanes. Even so, most Soviet pilots held the King Cobra in high regard, praising its impressive rate of climb, maneuverability, and firepower. Legendary Soviet aces, such as Alexander Pokrishkin, had a personal predilection for the aircraft and admired its formidable capabilities in combat. Ultimately, the P-63 King Cobra played a significant role in World War II as a highly effective fighter aircraft used by the Soviet Union. Its advanced features, such as a powerful engine and armament, made it a formidable opponent in air-to-air combat. The aircraft's versatility and reliability were well suited for various roles, including ground attack and reconnaissance missions. Its success on the Eastern Front helped to turn the tide of the war in favor of the Soviet Union, and the P-63 King Cobra was a crucial asset that provided air superiority and contributed to the eventual defeat of the Axis powers. Built like a tank, but agile as a falcon, the twin-engine Bristol Beaufighter was full of contradictions, earning it a reputation that left enemies puzzled and allies grateful. On June 12, 1942, a Beaufighter, piloted by Ken Gatward, skimmed dangerously low over the English Channel, aiming for the very heart of Nazi-occupied Paris. At such low altitudes, the threat of anti-aircraft fire increased by the minute as he approached the continent. The iconic Arc de Triomphe loomed ahead, and the aircraft released its unexpected cargo, a French tricolore. The flag fluttered to the ground, a daring message of Allied audacity and hope planted in the heart of Nazi-occupied France. Pivoting sharply, the Beaufighter set its sights on its next target, the Gestapo headquarters at the Place de la Concorde. Guns blazing, the bow unleashed havoc, rattling the enemy's nerve center. Whatever the mission, the Bristol Beaufighter was always up for the challenge. Before World War II, many nations prioritized single-engine fighters designed for day intercept missions. These agile, lightweight aircraft were well suited for quick operations, but fell short in range and firepower, limiting their utility in prolonged or specialized operations. However, one exception to this rule was Germany. Equipped with long-range heavy fighters, such as the Messerschmitt Bf-110, the Third Reich's Air Force could execute various roles, from escort missions to ground attacks, thanks to extended flight ranges and heavier armaments. As hostilities in Europe loomed, the Royal Air Force recognized a pressing need for a new twin-engine fighter. While the RAF's mainstays, the Hurricane and Spitfire, were excellent in their roles, they lacked the range and payload to adequately counter growing threats from German bombers and naval forces. The UK's glaring aerial arsenal deficiency prompted action. In late 1938, Bristol's design team, led by Leslie Fries, privately initiated a project based on their latest achievement, the Beaufort, a general reconnaissance and torpedo bomber. After a thorough evaluation, the team found the Beaufort structurally robust, particularly in its wings, nacelles, undercarriage, and tail. They concluded that these features were promising for further development to enhance speed and agility. With this in mind, the team embarked on crafting the ultimate Allied long-range aircraft. In just over 6 months, the team presented the Royal Air Force with the first prototype Bristol Beaufighter. Bristol engineers repurposed the Beaufort airframe to create the Beaufighter prototype, saving time and resources. They modified the design under the guidance of lead designers Fries and Roy Fatton, who narrowed the fuselage, added a single-seat cockpit, and designated a dorsal spot for a navigator and observer. Recognizing the aircraft's potential, the Royal Air Force's Air Ministry swiftly approved an initial contract for 300 Beaufighters. This expedited approval occurred 2 weeks before the aircraft's first test flight, reflecting the urgency of the UK's extensive rearmament program. The Beaufighter prototype flew for the first time on July 17, 1939, under the command of Captain Ewens, a few short weeks before Germany invaded Poland and ignited World War II. Soon after the outbreak of hostilities, the Royal Air Force increased its orders substantially, even placing one for an astonishing 918 units shortly after receiving the first batch of production models. During a visit to Bristol's Filton facility in 1940, Lord Beaverbrook, the Minister of Aircraft Production, took the opportunity to highlight the Beaufighter's crucial importance to the war effort. He strongly encouraged its rapid integration into the Royal Air Force's operational lineup. By fighter standards, the Beaufighter, equipped with powerful but relatively quiet Hercules engines, was somewhat heavy and slow, weighing 16,000 pounds and barely reaching a maximum speed of 335 miles per hour. Though its considerable size initially sparked doubt, the Bristol Beaufighter would quickly prove invaluable. The Bristol Beaufighter entered service in July 1940, a year after the war started, at a critical juncture for the RAF. As Luftwaffe tactics shifted to nighttime bombing during the Battle of Britain, the RAF turned to the Beaufighter for its nocturnal operations. Coinciding with the advent of British airborne interception radar sets, the Beaufighter was a game-changer. Its nose cone housed a Mark IV radar connected to an observer's scope. At night, this setup enabled the aircraft to spot enemy planes while intercom guidance led the pilot to the target. Though also radar-equipped, the simultaneously used Bristol Blenheim IF couldn't match the Beaufighter's speed and firepower, which could make quick work of German Bf-110 night bombers with a short burst from its 4 20mm Hispano cannons. The pairing of radar and the Beaufighter proved incredibly effective in night combat. The aircraft was also fast enough to catch and inflict severe damage on German bombers. The RAF's No. 219 Squadron earned the Beaufighter's first aerial win by taking down a Dornier Do-17Z on October 25, 1940. The first radar-aided victory came against a Junkers Ju-88 on November 19, 1940. In just 6 months, Beaufighters, guided by their sensitive radars, had eliminated more than a dozen Nazi aircraft. By then, the Battle of Britain was over, and more advanced radar systems were being rolled out. Air Marshal W. Sholto Douglas underscored its impact in April 1941. Beaufighters, comprising just 21% of night sorties, were responsible for over 65% of enemy aircraft destruction. This compelling track record caused Douglas to push for a substantial increase in Beaufighter numbers. In addition to its role as a night fighter, the Beaufighter was one of World War II's first multi-role aircraft. Its strong airframe allowed adaptability to various weapons and mission profiles, even in challenging weather. The model became one of the first land-based torpedo aircraft of the war, and was also an essential asset in the RAF's Coastal Command for the entirety of the conflict. Especially crucial during the peak German U-boat activity, the Beau, armed with torpedoes and heavy guns, was effective against both U-boats and surface ships, and undertook long-range reconnaissance, providing valuable information to the Allies. Its versatility made it invaluable for long-range missions to strike enemy bases and shipping, even reaching Norway. Despite its size, which some believed to be clunky, the Beaufighter was a complete workhorse. With the forward-placed engines, the plane's overall ruggedness and versatility, and its 4 cannons, occasionally acting as protective skids, became a strength rather than a weakness, eventually helping win the pilots over. According to a veteran pilot, quote, "I've seen a Beau go through a copse of trees. through the earthwork surrounding an ammunition hut, through the brick-built hut, and finished up literally just an armored box, with the pilot sustaining only a broken leg and his observer uninjured. On one of the most audacious operations in World War II, a Beaufighter from RAF No. 236 Squadron, piloted by Flight Lieutenant A.K. Ken Gatward, with Sergeant G. Fern as his observer, the duo performed a low-level daylight operation on June 12, 1942, dropping a French tricolor flag right on top of the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, in occupied France. Soon after, the Beaufighter began service overseas as the war expanded through Europe and beyond. In the North African and Mediterranean theaters, the Bristol Beaufighter demonstrated its extreme versatility, entering service in 1941 to take on various roles. On land, the Beaufighter excelled in aiding the British Eighth Army, most notably in the Second Battle of El Alamein in late 1942. There, the aircraft took on duties from reconnaissance to ground strafing and bombing enemy installations. Its vital role helped achieve an Allied victory by decimating enemy positions and paving the way for infantry. The Beaufighter also played a key role in safeguarding crucial convoys to Tobruk and Malta, executing anti-submarine patrols over Royal Navy vessels in the Mediterranean Sea. As the aircraft evolved, modifications and variants also came into play. Over time, engineers restructured its tail and issued guidelines to counter the plane's swing during takeoff. Later versions adapted to the readily available inline Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. Subsequent rocket projectiles added to the Beaufighter's lethality. Some models were even retrofitted to carry torpedoes and bombs. With the capacity to slice small crafts in two and sink 800-ton vessels, observers claimed the Beaufighter could unleash so much firepower that it seemed the aircraft, quote, halted in midair due to the recoil. The Bristol Beaufighter multi-role aircraft arrived in Asia and the Pacific in mid-1942. While the aircraft had already achieved success across the RAF, it was in Burma and the Dutch East Indies where the type truly won over any remaining doubters and cemented its reputation. In these environments, the aircraft and their operators once again demonstrated their effectiveness, battling over both tropical forests and expansive seas under severe weather conditions that often pose significant challenges to maintenance and logistics. In the Far East, the Beaufighter became known as the Whispering Death, because the quiet, fast, and low-flying model often caught the Japanese by surprise, giving them little time to respond. To counter this threat, the Japanese resorted to various tactics. One rudimentary method was stringing steel cables between two trees in the hope of snaring an Allied plane. However, such tactics had little impact as the Allies continued their attacks, further weakening the already overstretched Japanese supply lines. Simply put, its unrivaled mix of cannons and gunpowder, coupled with its rocket and torpedo capabilities, presented a challenge that the Japanese simply could not match or counter. In March 1943, the Bristol Beaufighter demonstrated its reliability again during the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, which took place in the southwestern Pacific Ocean near New Guinea. The battle focused on a Japanese convoy of 8 transports and 8 destroyers, protected by 100 fighters. This convoy aimed to carry reinforcements to Lae, New Guinea, an area already under Allied aerial surveillance. To thwart the enemy's reinforcement efforts, the Allies, primarily the United States 5th Air Force and the Royal Australian Air Force, targeted the convoy using various aircraft, including A-20 Havocs, B-17 Flying Fortresses, B-25 Mitchells, and Australian Bristol Beaufighters from No. 30 Squadron. Tasked with attacking and sinking enemy ships, the Beaufighters played a vital role in low-altitude strikes against the convoy. When the Japanese spotted these large fighters, they wrongly identified them as Bristol Beaufort's torpedo planes. This crucial misstep led them to reposition their ships to present a smaller profile. Seizing this unexpected advantage, the Beaufighters unleashed their 20mm cannons in a strafing run that caught the Japanese completely off guard. This initial surprise attack paved the way for subsequent bombing runs and strafing assaults by other Allied aircraft, setting a large part of the Japanese convoy ablaze. War correspondent and filmmaker Damien Perrer captured the Beaufighter's role in the battle as he flew during the engagement, standing behind one of the pilots. His footage helped make the Beaufighter one of the most iconic aircraft in Australian service during the conflict. The battle had a catastrophic outcome for the Japanese. Of the nearly 6,900 troops involved, only about 1,200 reached their destination, while the majority of their convoy was destroyed. This resulted in the loss of approximately 2,890 soldiers and sailors. Even General Douglas MacArthur lauded the battle as one of the most decisive and successful engagements of all time, forcing the Japanese into a defensive position for the rest of the war. On June 15, 1944, just days after D-Day, over 36 Bristol bows, including 9 bristling with potent torpedoes, soared from Langham, England. These planes rendezvoused with 9 North American P-51 Mustangs, providing fighter cover. They'd just gotten word 2 large enemy ships and 17 escorts were about to set sail from Den Helder, north of Amsterdam. The first wave of bows unleashed their rockets and cannons, sending the ship's gunners scrambling for cover. Following this, the 9 torpedo-laden bowfighters, nicknamed Torblows, swooped in to deliver one final coup de grace. As the smoke cleared, the tally for the Allies came in. They had sunk 2 merchant ships and 1 escort while damaging 10 more. Miraculously, all aircraft made it back. The bowfighters stayed in the fight until the very last minute of the war. In May 1945, with Germany teetering on the edge of surrender, these aircraft undertook what's often cited as the final military mission of the European theater, striking German naval assets in the Skagerrak Strait between Norway and Denmark. On September 21st, the last bowfighter exited the Bristol Aeroplane Company's assembly line. By then, a staggering 5,562 of these versatile planes had been built. Originally a product of hasty improvisation, the Bristol Bowfighter became an Allied staple, serving in every major theater of the war. The mighty bow's legacy endured post-war, gracing the skies for various nations, from Israel and Turkey to Portugal and the Dominican Republic, until 1960.